Hi, I'm Brandon, and I play the saxophone. The saxophone is one of the most recognizable instruments that you might see on an orchestra stage, though you won't often see it on the orchestra stage. It's really recognizable because it is frequently used in rock and roll, jazz, funk music, popular genres that are seen all the time on TV, and you hear them in pop songs on the radio. You don't see it very often in orchestras, though that is changing some. The saxophone is one of the newest instruments that you'll see on an orchestra stage, invented in the mid 19th century, and it didn't really become popular at all until the early 20th century, and then it kind of exploded in popularity when swing band music became popular. So, what I want to do first is introduce you to the saxophone, and so I've brought several saxophones here, and you can see one here in the shot right now. I'm going to introduce you first to what would be considered probably the most common, the standard saxophone, which is this one, the alto saxophone. All right, the alto saxophone is what most beginner band students would start on. It's pitched in the key of E flat, which means on this instrument, when you finger a C natural, the sound that comes out of the instrument is an E flat. The saxophones are all pitched in B flat and E flat, or modern saxophones are pitched in B flat and E flat, because those are the keys that were really prevalent in early band music and in wind band music, and especially military band music. So the saxophone's very easy to play in flat keys. Okay, so the saxophone has several parts. I'm going to take this apart just a little bit and show you the pieces. All right, so this main piece doesn't really come apart in any smaller pieces. It has to be taken to a special technician to be able to come apart smaller than this, and I'm not going to do that because I wouldn't be able to get it back together. So this main piece is called the body, and the body has this piece called the bell as part of it, and the bow where it bends, and then the rest of it is just a tube, and the saxophone is conical, meaning it's shaped like a cone. If you straightened the whole thing out, it would look like a really long skinny cone, and that has a lot of impact on what the saxophone sound actually is. Now, let me put this piece down, and I'm going to show you a couple more pieces. All right. This piece is called the neck. The neck has this little key on it, which is called an octave key, which is a really important part of why the saxophone is easy to play. All right. And then over here, I have a saxophone mouthpiece. This is just a cap to protect the reed that's on the mouthpiece and to help keep the reed from drying out too much. I'm going to set it aside for right now. All right, on the mouthpiece, there are a few pieces here, and I'm going to take them apart. All right, so the mouthpiece itself, right, it's just, it has a little hole in it, and this slides onto the neck, and it won't make any sound on its own, so we have to add this reed to it. This reed is just a piece of cane, and it's very carefully cut and sanded down to a specific shape and thickness. And when you put this on the mouthpiece and blow into it, it vibrates, which creates the sound. This is called a ligature, and there are a lot of different kinds and shapes of these, but they all serve the same purpose, which is to hold the reed onto the mouthpiece. So I'm going to do that right now. Reeds have to be a little bit wet to work properly. So if you ever see a saxophonist putting their reed in their mouth, it's not just because they're hungry. It's because the reed has to be a little bit wet to be able to seal onto the mouthpiece properly. Okay, so I'm being careful to put this on there, and I'm tightening this little screw on the ligature, and now I have a mouthpiece with a reed and a ligature on it. And I'm going to take that, I'm going to put it on this neck, all right? And this neck has some cork on the end so that we can put that on there and seal it. And let's see, just make sure I didn't knock anything out of alignment. And now I'm going to pick up the main piece of the saxophone, the body, and up here at the top, we have a spot that this neck fits into. All right, right, and now it's on there. I'm going to tighten this screw just a little bit. Make sure everything's in the position I like it to be in. And there we go. That is an alto saxophone that has been fully assembled. Here on my neck is not just a fashion statement. This is my neck strap. Saxophone has this little hook on the back, and we hook that on there, and it lets the weight of the saxophone come off of your neck instead of having to hold it up by your hands. And now that the instrument is all put together, we can play it. All right, so I'm going to set that down and introduce you to some other parts of the saxophone family. The saxophone is part of a larger family called the woodwinds, and as I just showed you, we have this piece of cane or wood on here, and that's why it's called a woodwind. The sound comes from vibrating that reed. Other instruments in the woodwind family are clarinets, flutes, and double reeds like the oboe and the English horn are also woodwinds. A common misconception is that the saxophone is a brass instrument because it's made out of metal, and it is actually made out of brass, but that's not why brass instruments are called brass instruments. The saxophone is a woodwind because it uses this reed style sound generation, and because the key work is similar to other woodwinds in the family, other instruments in the woodwind family. Okay, so the saxophone has its own family, and there are a lot of pieces to it. In the modern times, you generally see 4 saxophones: the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the baritone. There are also sopraninos. There are also bass and contrabass saxophones. They're not very common. They exist, but you don't see them very often. The saxophones have little things about them that look different, but mostly the difference is in the size of the instrument. The bigger the instrument, the lower the pitch that comes out. And I would demonstrate that to you. First, I wanted to show you that saxophones, they all basically have the same pieces. So you're going to see that saxophones all have a body and a neck and a mouthpiece, a reed, and a ligature. Now I have to give you one little disclaimer. One of the saxophones I'm going to show you is very old and doesn't actually have a separate neck from its body. Modern saxophones like this tend to have a neck that separates, but on mine it's built in, so it's one body piece. So on this saxophone, it's just a neck, or just a body and a mouthpiece, reed, and ligature. But basically all saxophones have a body, a neck, a mouthpiece, a reed, and a ligature. And what I wanted to show you here was the difference in size between the saxophones in something that's really easy to see. This is a soprano saxophone mouthpiece, and you can see it has the ligature and it has a reed on there. And this is a baritone saxophone mouthpiece. And again, you can see it has the ligature and a reed. You may notice this reed looks kind of funny. That's because it's a synthetic reed. It is still very much the same type of sound. And on the very large saxophones, like this mouthpiece goes on, I prefer to use that synthetic reed. All right, here's the difference in size between those. Isn't that interesting how big the baritone mouthpiece is and how small the soprano mouthpiece is? Okay, now I'm going to put these mouthpieces on their instruments. I'm going to give you a little demonstration. All right, so this is a soprano saxophone. You'd notice 2 things right off the bat, I bet. One is that it's not curved like the other saxophone we looked at. All the saxophones I'm going to show you today have a big curve in them, at least one big curve, except for this one, which is totally straight. They do make curved versions of this instrument, but most commonly you'll see this straight. And that's just to make the mechanics of the key work a little easier and to make it easier to fit your hands on it. It gets to be a pretty small instrument when it's curved. All right, so I'm going to put my mouthpiece, which already has its reed and ligature on it, on here. All right, and so this is a fully assembled soprano saxophone. And you can see it has the mouthpiece, reed, and ligature on one end. The neck is built into the body, and you can see with this that the body is a big cone, right? It's very small on this end and quite a bit bigger on this end. and then there's a bell on this end. All right, so here's what the soprano saxophone sounds like. Have my octave key stuck because I let it sit here for too long. All right, so one thing you might notice is the soprano saxophone has a very high-pitched sound, and that's what it's for. It's the smallest saxophone, so it gets the highest up. All right, so I'm going to play the lowest note, and I'm going to play a scale up to the highest note. So. Right, so that was the lowest note up to the highest note. All of the saxophones I'm going to play today have the same written range. They all, when I'm reading music on the saxophone, the lowest note on all of these instruments is a B flat. The highest note on all these instruments is an F. Now the note that you hear is not a B flat or an F, because as I said before, these are pitched in different keys. This is a B flat instrument, so when I finger a low C, what you hear is a low B flat. All right, so when I'm not going to go into the details of that transposition more than that, but that's what's going on here. So this is a B flat instrument, and this is the highest and smallest of the saxophone family. All right, going up from there is the alto saxophone, which I already showed you. Here it is again, fully assembled, and I'm going to play, again, the lowest note and a scale up to the highest note. So I'm going to finger the exact same notes. So that was a B flat major scale starting on low B flat and going up to high F, which is the highest note on these instruments. But it's going to sound different. Right? So it still gets high up there, but it's a lot lower on the low end than the soprano and doesn't get quite as high as the soprano. All right. So I'm going to set the alto down and putting this cap back on to protect my reed. All right. And another saxophone that you'll see very frequently is the tenor. The alto and the tenor are in the middle of the saxophone family, so you'll see them a lot. This is the tenor. I don't think I can fit, there we go, kind of fit the whole thing in there. All right. So the tenor is bigger than the alto and bigger than the soprano, smaller than the baritone. All right, and you'll see up here the neck has this curve in it, and I have my mouthpiece, ligature and reed. I'm going to take this little cap off of it. And I'm going to play a few notes on it, and then I'm going to demonstrate the range. All right, so I'm going to play the same scale now that I played on the soprano and the alto. All right, so that was a scale going from the low B flat all the way up to the high F, and you'll notice it's quite a bit lower than the soprano, a little bit lower than the alto. All right, so I'm going to cap this. Okay, and now I'm going to introduce to you the biggest of the family we have here, which is the baritone saxophone, or the bari. And I have to be careful because, as you can see, it really is much larger than the other instruments in the family. If I lean way back, there we go, we can see it. And we see that it has a really large bend in it. And then up here, it bends around again before it goes out to the neck. All right. So I'm going to put this mouthpiece on, and then I'm going to demonstrate the sound of the baritone saxophone and the range. All right, so. All right, before I play the actual range, I have to correct myself. I said that all of these saxophones have a range written of B flat, low B flat to high F. The baritone actually has one more key at the bottom. Instead of going all the way down to a B flat, it goes down to an A. So here's a B flat, and the A. Right, so it goes lower. Okay, so now I'm going to play the low A all the way up to the highest note. Right, so the highest note does feel pretty high, but the low note definitely feels very low, and I'm sure you can hear the difference in sound overall between these instruments. Okay, so I'm going to put this baritone back. I'm going to pick up the tenor and do a little bit more demonstration of what kind of sound can come out of the saxophone. So I said earlier that the saxophone is not really commonly seen in an orchestra. It has had history in orchestra, but very little. Some romantic composers used it a little bit, but it's not as common as something like a clarinet or a flute or a trumpet. Okay, one reason for that is because the saxophone is so new, and by the time the saxophone was invented, the tradition of scoring for an orchestra was already fully in place, and so a lot of composers have been reluctant to add saxophone, either because they don't know if the orchestra that's going to play their music will even have access to a saxophone, especially a long time ago, or they weren't trained on how to write for saxophone because it didn't exist for so long. Now, that's actually changing. Modern composers are writing for saxophone quite a bit. One of the reasons is because the saxophone has been around for a while now, maybe not a long time compared to something like a flute, but it's been around long enough to really develop a sound and for a lot of virtuosity to develop in saxophonists. So composers write for saxophone knowing that they can get a different sound than you could get out of a flute or a clarinet or a trumpet, and still get a virtuosic player, meaning that player can play whatever you put in front of them. That's one small reason. Maybe the biggest reason people like to write for the saxophone is because the saxophone can produce a really wide variety of sounds from the instrument. It was invented to kind of fill a little bit of a gap between the brass section and the woodwind section. Adolf Sax, the inventor, was trying to create an instrument that was durable, could be played with woodwind-style fingerings, which are kind of make it easy to play really fast, and also to be able to be bright and loud when needed so that it can fit into a brass section. And as such, a lot of people consider the saxophone to sort of sit in both families a little bit. It's definitely a woodwind instrument, but in terms of its sound, it can blend really well with either family. So in addition to the ability to blend with other families in the orchestra, the saxophone itself can make a lot of different sounds. So what I've been playing for you is what I would consider a clean tone or a straight tone. All right. One thing that you can do is something called a subtone, and you hear this a lot in jazz. It does get used in modern orchestral music when people are writing for the saxophone sometimes, but it's definitely known for jazz. So here's a line in straight tone. Here's the same line in a subtone. So you can hear it's a lot darker, and you hear that fuzziness, all that air coming into it. That's one of the things. Another thing the saxophone's really famous for is something called a growl, and you'll hear this a lot in rock and roll saxophone. So without a growl, and with a growl, and the growl is done in a few different ways. The way I do the growl is I hum into the saxophone, and the clash in the pitch that I'm humming with the pitch that is trying to happen inside the saxophone creates that growl. A much more aggressive kind of growling sound is something called a flutter tongue. Most wind instruments will play with a flutter tongue at times. The saxophone's really famous for it through its use in rock and roll music. So here's the sound of a flutter tongue. Right? I'm sure you've heard that before. All right, another thing the saxophone can do is called a slap tongue, which gives you this very percussive sound. Right? So that sound is really popular with modern composers because there's been a trend in modern composition to really dig into percussive sounds. So the saxophone can easily get into those sounds. I'm going to switch horns real quickly to show you another sound that I just thought of. I didn't put on my script here, but it just occurred to me. The saxophone can play something called a multiphonic. As you've noticed, the saxophone, all the stuff I've been playing is one note at a time, and wind instruments are typically thought of as only being able to play one note at a time. The saxophone, others too, but the saxophone, it actually gets used quite a bit, can play something that kind of sounds like two notes being played at the exact same time. It's not what's really happening. What's really happening is the saxophone is kind of flipping back and forth between two notes, but it's happening so fast that it sounds like they're happening at the same time. All right, and that probably sounds a little aggressive and in your face and maybe not too pleasant, and I'll give you that. But it is asked for quite a bit by modern composers. I'm going to play that same multiphonic again, and I'm going to attempt to start with the multiphonic and focus down to the high note, and then go back to the multiphonic, and then focus down to the low note so you can hear that split. So hopefully you could hear all those sounds. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the tenor, which is what I play most often, to demonstrate the last bit of saxophone technique that I'm going to share with you today. So I've given you the range of the saxophone as being this low B flat to high F, with the exception of the bari, which goes all the way down to low A. So here's those notes. So low B flat on the tenor, high F on the tenor. So the range of all of these saxophones actually extends dramatically past that. That's just considered the standard range. The range continues. I'm not even going to try to put an end point on how high it goes, but we'll just say it goes very high with a technique called altissimo, where we start using some more unusual fingerings to kind of adjust the venting of the saxophone. And that combined with some shapes here that I'll make inside my throat, and with the position of like my tongue in my mouth and the soft palate, I will get the saxophone to go much higher than the written range of low B flat to high F. So I'm going to start on the high F, that is the standard written range, and I'm going to proceed up quite a bit. Right, so that, as you can tell, went very high. I got that up to a full octave above the written range. And it goes quite a bit higher than that. You might hear a famous saxophonist named Lenny Pickett, who plays famously with the Saturday Night Live band. And when you hear that incredible wailing, screaming, crazy high saxophone with the Saturday Night Live band, what you're hearing is Lenny Pickett playing in the extreme altissimo register. Okay, that's all I have for you to demonstrate the saxophone. I'm going to play a little jazz piece here for your enjoyment. I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about the saxophone, and maybe it'll inspire you to pick up an instrument. If not the saxophone, maybe another instrument. I'll see you around. Bye.